It's been 20 years since the release of the first Halo. Just look at that old Joe. Still looks pretty good even today. And how much fuss did it make at the time of release? My oh my. But actually, it's astonishing that some first-person shooter managed to hold its place on the console market and develop a whole universe comparable with Star Wars. What has the franchise done to hook players, and what is the secret behind the Halo phenomenon? Today, we'll be answering these questions here on Dragmatic. Please be sure to subscribe and smash the bell button as we are about to begin. The path of Halo Combat Evolved has been tough. First, the young Bungie team, after having released a successful RTT called Myth, decides to go while the going is good, and, inspired by the success of StarCraft, begins developing a sci-fi strategy game in the late 90s. Thus, the famous Spartan armor was born. During the early stages, all units on the map were wearing it. To put something new to the familiar genre, the developers decided to give the player an opportunity to zoom in on individual characters to feel not only as the commander, but as an ordinary trooper as well. Then, during the playtests, it became apparent that gamers prefer to get in a vehicle and explore the vast spaces themselves instead of remotely controlling the troops on the global map. Bungie learned from that and decided not to take away the experience that so many players were in love with. Quite the opposite. They decided to make it the cornerstone of the game. Thus, the upcoming hit was now resembling a third-person shooter. Somewhere around here, the ambitious developers had already made an arrangement with Apple about the exclusive release of their game on Macintosh, a PC by Steve Jobs. By the way, Jobs personally presented the title in 1999 at the Macwork Expo.
And so I'm very happy to welcome on the stage Jason Jones, who is the co-founder of Bungie and the Halo project lead. Halo is the name of this game, and we're going to see for the first time Halo. Welcome, Jason.
That's how sure everyone was about the game's success. What can I say? The hype was real, especially considering that we're talking about the end of the 20th century. In the summer of 2000, the development company is acquired by Microsoft. It was all about the new Myth game. Because of a serious bug, the guys called off all the copies, which cost them tons of money. Bungie doesn't have a choice, and in order to finish the shooter, they sell out. Such a move adds a new platform for which the game has to be adapted. The new console from Microsoft with a gamepad half the size of the console itself. To say that the developer team was freaked out would be an understatement. Xbox demanded the system seller game to be in the popular genre, so it was urgently decided to change the concept once again to make a first-person shooter instead of a third-person one. This is where the fun part of Halo's history begins. First, Apple is out of the equation and the game becomes a console-exclusive shooter. Secondly, gameplay and level designers start working on the unit control systems. How to preserve the dynamics in a genre that has always been considered to be purely for PC. How to transfer mouse and keyboard gameplay to a console so that the player would still be comfortable. As a solution, Bungie added a bunch of hidden assisting mechanics to the game. For example, the game assisted in aiming so it would be easier to hit the enemy. The hitboxes of the enemies were also expanded for the same reason. All these aspects are balanced in such a way that they don't stick out and annoy the player, leaving him with the impression that everything he's done is purely his own merit. And we must say, the developers achieved their goal. Before Bungie, no one had managed to create responsive and comfortable controls in an FPS on a console, and now, here you are. It's all about the distribution of duties between the available control elements. As decided by the game's level designer James Griezmer, if there are two sticks, let each of them be responsible for just one thing. So the right stick became responsible for the movement of the protagonist's body, while the left stick was now used to move the camera. The purity of the gaming experience was also affected by the way the player was feeling each weapon. The developers thoroughly worked out the recoil and impact of the hits. Coupled with aiming, which no longer resembled an epileptic seizure, the simultaneous movement and shooting mechanics turned out to be quite good. Surprisingly good actually. So good in fact that it was adopted by the majority of future shooters which reported to consoles. By the way, an inventory that has 2 weapons is a Halo thing as well. The solution allowed to provide a certain strategic element to each fight. Now the player had to decide what weapon, on what terrain, and against which enemy he will need. Should he take a shotgun or a plasma rifle? Sticky grenades or regular ones? The console peculiarities made it possible to invent a new, more thoughtful gameplay. The thoughtful gameplay, benefited from the AI of the enemies. The foes in Halo were surprisingly smart. They had an inviolable hierarchy obeyed by everyone. For example, if you killed the squad leader, the so-called elite, then his sidekicks, grunts and jackals will panic or simply run away. In other words, it wasn't the smartest AI of them all, such as in FEAR, which, by the way, was still 4 years away, but it certainly was the most lively AI, which also added to the strategic variety. The variety was also added by the vehicle fleet. The sci-fi shooter allowed you to take control of a large number of military vehicles, from SUVs with machine guns to single-seat alien flying crafts. Such things were mostly used by those who didn't want to rack their brains too much. Why bother with weapons and enemy types when you can just get into a flying contraption and get where you need, and raise a racket on the arena while you're at it? Speaking of arenas, the final touch in planning each attack was their design. We will save the visual part for later and jump straight to gameplay and combat opportunities that they provided, as semi-open locations and the resulting tactical freedom later became somewhat of a signature element of the whole series. Funny enough, because of this very freedom, the company even had ridiculous anecdotic occasions. For example, on the levels inside alien structures, you could see weird arrows on the floor, as if they're showing you the way. In reality, this was not a helping hand from superior beings, but hints for testers who were always struggling with the location. To be honest, I didn't find these assisting elements, but I was never lost either. Or maybe such artifacts that show how much time did the devs lack for polishing were simply cut out in the 2014 re-edition. Who knows? If other developers of shooter games took notes of Bungie's 2 weapon slots and character controls, then large locations unfortunately remained unnoticed. But there was something else that became viral, something without which it is now impossible to imagine almost any first-person shooter: health auto-regeneration. The Halo universe provided a simple explanation for this feature. We play as a super soldier who is wearing super armor, and since everyone and everything is super, the suit is capable of restoring its protective qualities after taking damage. Of course, the process requires a certain amount of time, but this is a fair price. So, do you see what's the secret behind the Halo phenomenon? It's a first-person shooter that came out on a platform that wasn't designed for this genre. It managed to convince the mass player that it was the right thing to do and make video game developers reconsider their approach when it comes to creating such titles. Halo was the first game to introduce a bunch of decisions that no one even thought about before: limiting carryable weapons, auto-regen, assisting the player in aiming on the console. In terms of gameplay, the echoes of Bungie's work can still be heard today, but the mechanics make up only a part of the success. So what about the story? After all, the game performed well in this field as well, which is why many users complain about the story in Infinite and claim that it used to be better. You know what? The reviewers actually have a point. It really used to be better. The beginning of the game was quite unusual. The player was shown a huge, angular space cruiser called Pillar of Autumn, constructed in the best traditions of either cubism, lack of taste, or the console's lack of polygons. So to speak, anything for the sake of optimization. But in reality, of course, the problem lied elsewhere, and the player realizes it very soon, as the shown shuttle is in fact a military craft, and military goes hand in hand with such austerity. The ship is attacked by aliens, and to provide defense, the captain decides to bring the game's protagonist, Master Chief, out of cryosleep, a fighting machine made on the basis of a human. Wearing a high-tech exoskeleton, he looks more like a robot, but his brains are human, which makes Chief familiar with the concepts of duty and morality that distinguishes him from lifeless steel. Which Pillar of Autumn soon becomes. The aliens, called the Covenant, overtake the ship, fall aboard, and force the remaining crew to leave. The survivors land on some sort of a ring spinning in the open space. It's unclear what it is. The radars detected it just before the Covenant attack, so it's up to Chief to uncover all the secrets of this enormous and clearly man-made structure. But Chief won't be alone on his quest. He will have an AI assistant named Cortana, the girl who was the main subject of every 5th grader's dreams from the early 2000s, even of those who weren't familiar with the game. She was an incredibly intelligent lady with great sense of humor. The chemistry between her and the Spartan was awesome. Cortana's sarcastic banter and succinct commentary on the subject diluted the gameplay, giving the whole story a shade of realism.
Sleep well?
No thanks to your driving, yes.
So you did miss me.
What's interesting is that even in the game, she was only a projection of a human, a digitized mind. But at the time, the projection was so lively, so folksy, that it was only a matter of time before the player falls in love with her. For me personally, Cortana became the best video game waifu for years to come. What? Her presence essentially brings an average gamer closer to the brave and mighty Master Chief. Both of them have a crush on a non-existent girl. After an emergency landing on Halo, the player will enjoy a fascinating adventure several hours long. It will contain exploration of futuristic structures, saving fellow soldiers, learning the secret behind the Halo ring, a drastic change of the enemy, and, of course, an epic kaboom at the end. It would take an hour or more to describe all of that in detail, because the story is truly intense and, most importantly, captivating. Halo is a case when the events are not piled up in a mess, but spring from one another, forming an incredible but cohesive story, the beauty of which is hard to believe in unless you see it with your own eyes. That's why I advise you to play Combat Evolved yourself if you haven't already done so. To be honest, initially the game appealed with its appearance, and I'm not just talking about the outstanding graphics for the time. From the outside, it seemed as if Halo had every signature trait of a decent science fiction, yet at the same time, it possessed many everyday life elements which didn't allow it to completely lose the touch with reality. Just take the renowned Warthog Jeep. In terms of visually separating the enemies, the developers had also done a good job. Human and Covenant weapons looked very different. The first ones had sharp and square forms, while the style of the second group was dominated by beveled corners. Such a design not only helped to distinguish an enemy from a friend, but also hinted on who were the superior race. Actually, the story will eventually reveal who is the true superior race in the Halo universe, though this won't happen until the middle of the game, at the point where the title turns from a cluster of references to various space battle movies into one huge reference to 1987 Predator. This transformation is not something bad, quite the opposite. It's actually a great thing. Classic science fiction suddenly becomes unsettling and claustrophobic. This makes the game more down to earth, while not entirely turning it into a realistic shooter about military operations. If I were to use metaphors, I'd say that Halo is Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, which then develops a vibe of classical Alien and Predator. The game's music only adds to these vibes. What do you think the player sees even before he is shown the Pillar of Autumn, the Covenant, and everything else? The main menu, of course. And that screen makes up half of the Halo experience, largely thanks to the soundtrack. My god, it was awesome. The mysterious, deep ambient slowly turning from some Aztec tunes, well, at least they seemed Aztec to me, into something harsh and militarized. In the background, as if syncing with the music, there was this huge hollow disc spinning in open space, Well, by spinning I mean that I thought it was spinning. Together with the soundtrack, such an illusion added a special charm of anticipation. I remember thinking at the time that I was in for something connected with Maya pyramids and other stuff from South America, while the space and all that was just a decoration that has nothing to do with the story, like in Serious Sam. But that's not how it turned out to be. It turned out to be much more serious than that, if you will. Fuck, that was a good pun. On one hand, I could try acting like Thanos and say that reality is often disappointing. But on the other hand, this is not the case. By combining orchestra and choral singing with military tunes, Martin O'Donnell found a unique sound that immediately gave the video game series a face.
So it was like, that just felt like a really nice announcement and a fanfare feel.
Or rather a voice that can't be confused with anything else. By the way, O'Donnell is responsible for another revolutionary technology in the video game industry, which was later adopted by other composers. He was the first one to come up with the idea to record several ambients, put transitions between them, and then tie those ambient to the gameplay. Thus, when the player engaged in a fight, more aggressive music kicked in. And when he was wandering around the fortress of the race older than the Covenant, yes, you heard it right, something ominous and creepy started playing in the background, which created the great atmosphere that I've already mentioned. So, we've discussed both the plot and the soundtrack. Now we only have to answer the question posed in the very beginning. The Halo phenomenon consists of numerous successfully compiled elements which help the game to first stand out against the background and then to be used by other developers. If the industry hadn't adopted some of the game's features, it would have become an icon, but it has evolved into something far greater. I've already mentioned it, but allow me to reiterate. Hardly any shooter nowadays is released without the auto-regeneration system. Also, it is hard to find examples where the developers sacrifice the strategic diversity for the sake of weapon abundance in the gamer's inventory. This is added by the need to seek different ways to strike on the vast locations of the game, which have also become kind of a trend. Although, of course, it took some time for open and semi-open maps to become a must-have. Talking about other aspects of the game that were later developed in the industry, it is impossible not to mention the use of vehicles on the battlefield. To say that it was Halo which introduced the use of vehicles on vast maps would be an overstatement, because Battlefield 1942 was mere 1 year away, but the Bungie's title had clearly contributed. The same thing happened with the AI. Other developers didn't start to make their NPCs more lively right away, but the variety in the behavior of in-game dummies has certainly risen in value. And of course, what we can't forget is that all these gameplay elements have been brought together under the roof of a solid, fascinating story with a facade of beautiful soundtrack and recognizable yet original design. In the end, Halo was a well-made game. No, it actually was a brilliantly made game that no one expected to see on the platform on which it came out. Yes, I almost forgot. Bungie also created a standard for FPS controls for consoles. To sum up, Combat Evolved was the title that brought a bunch of innovations to the industry, but it didn't concentrate on them. Its primary objective was to tell a compelling story and build an intriguing world. And gamers appreciated it, so much in fact that 20 years later the series is still alive, although it mostly boasts the legacy obtained not from the pioneer, but from its sequel. However, we will talk about its own phenomenon in another video. For now, we would love it if you subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Smash the bell button and leave a like, of course. Please share with us in the comments when did you first launch Halo, and we will be back with a new video. See you on Drigmatic.